something happened which shakes my core to this day.
The sound of a child softly crying. My property, which I inherited from my father, is part of a bigger forest. Not a huge one, but 3 roads and a river square of a section of a dozen miles or so.
The property itself used to be a big cat preserve, so there are huge fences and derelict structures lining the entrance to the woods.
These used to scare my friends, especially at night. The place is beautiful, but has a fair bit of the horror movie vibe.
When I was a kid, I had horrible insomnia.
So from the age of 6 forward, I'd spend hours every night wandering those woods. Normally from around midnight to 3, I'd be alone in the woods, often exploring sections I'd never been through before.
So I'm not one to be easily frightened by the woods.
In fact, while I've had a few moments of fear in those dark glades and trails, only one experience ever struck true terror.
One afternoon that I either hallucinated or ran into a supernatural horror show. As I've never had a history of hallucinations before or since, will you be the judge? By my high school years, I knew that little forest like the back of my hand. A wild cougar which had spent time near me at the river for years brought his kids to see me one night.
Any fear I'd had of this forest and its creatures was past.
I knew that section of woods better than anyone. Probably still do. Now each year our neighbor who owns part of the forest tends to add new trails. During the day, I'd see them come flying through on quads, or cruising in a golf cart. Though I've been wandering around their property for decades, and they always smile and wave, we've never had a conversation. So when new trails are made, I don't know till I find them.
In the early years, this made it easy to get lost. Fortunately, if I pick a direction, I'll run into a river or road within a few miles, maybe 6 at the most.
After a few years, I didn't rely on the trails, and could tell where I was in the forest within minutes, no matter what section I was in. Even the patch a couple miles wide that has no trails at all. Now, full disclosure, the Blair Witch Project was when I saw it the third movie to truly scare me. Something about the found footage style struck my teen brain with real fear beyond why the plot deserves. So when I watched it one afternoon, I was a bit shaken and decided to calm down the way I always did, by wandering around the woods for a few hours.
My woods?
This might seem counterproductive, as indeed it turned out to be. But remember, I knew these woods.
So while the fear I was feeling was of getting lost in a strange forest, it didn't translate into fear of a forest I didn't think I could get lost in anymore.
Unfortunately, I was wrong. I'd been on a path close to the river for quite a while, heading in the direction of my driveway. A section of road used to go all the way to the river, and past that is a farm. So I was planning on looping around and heading home.
Then I saw a new trail. It was wider than most, looking almost like an old road. In fact, while I knew that it hadn't been there the week before, it didn't look newly cut. It even looked well used compared to the overgrown path I was on. It headed straight into the forest away from the river.
Now that section is cornered off by the river and the road I live on. The new trail was headed straight to my neighbor's backyard, knowing that my neighbor was straight that direction and less than a mile away. Decided to see if the trail went straight into their backyard. As it didn't curve and I couldn't see the end of it, this seemed like the logical option.
This is where logic leaves the story for a bit, unfortunately.
Now, I didn't have my phone, but the position of the sun told me there were a few hours left before sundown.
Not that I was worried about being out in the dark, more that I might miss dinner. Expecting to be in my neighbor's backyard within half an hour, this wasn't a concern, at first, and I set off down the off-trail. Now, by this point, my fear was completely gone. I wasn't thinking about the movie, or why I'd come out into the woods. In fact, I'd started daydreaming about my girlfriend. So when I started seeing plants and flowers I didn't recognize, it didn't strike me as odd. On the contrary, I thought it was cool that the area had even more biodiversity than before. Most of the flora was the same, but after the 5th or 6th new plant, I started paying more attention.
That was around the time I realized I'd been walking for well over an hour on the trail without finding a curve, or the expected neighbor.
When I looked back, there was a straight trail behind me which now led out of sight. I'm a fast walker, and had been moving at my regular speed. Once I realized I no longer knew where I was in the woods, I increased my pace, jogging from time to time. After all, I'd been heading in one direction for several miles. My knowledge of the area told me there had to be a road soon, no matter what direction I was going. At some point, I realized that the path I was on was longer than it should be. 2 or 3 hours had passed while I was moving briskly along it. This told me I'd traveled at least 10 miles in a patch of forest that's maybe 6 miles long at the longest. More than that, nothing around me looked familiar.
I recognize a fair number of trees in my forest, not just their type, but the individual trees themselves.
This was no longer my forest, but my brain kept telling me that if I kept going the same direction, there would be a road. I told myself I must have only thought the trail led straight away from the river. If it was angled to miss my neighbor, it would be 6 miles straight to the next property, and I must have misjudged the sun when I started, since it was now nearly dusk.
At my pace, this would have meant I traveled around 15 miles without seeing another trail or road. As I knew this to be impossible, I shook it off and kept moving.
However, fear had crept back up my spine by the time I saw the house. It was a white two-story house with vines growing up the outside, clearly abandoned. The forest opened up in a glade around it with bunches of brown-dead grass for a yard, out of place amid the sea of green.
My first instinct was to explore it.
I was excited.
See, I have a love of exploring abandoned places. I have been through many supposedly haunted locations, through every old military base in the state, and through various old stores and homesteads. One in particular has an open well I'd like to go back and explore.
So this was amazing. How was I missed this old place and the road to it for all these years?
Very briefly, the oddities of the journey were jettisoned from my mind as I slowly approached the house, trying to decide where to start. As I took in more details, however, the fear came back fast.
The arched roof with a chimney.
The upper story windows positioned almost like eyes with their own arches. I had seen this house before recently. In fact, the more I looked around, the more the section of the forest looked oddly familiar, just not like my forest. I glanced at the sun, which was in the middle of setting. That was when I had 3 realizations simultaneously, which filled me with more dread than I'd ever felt. It would be dark any minute. I was miles into a section of forest I didn't recognize, and which shouldn't exist. And the house I was looking at was the same as the one from Blair Witch, or so nearly that it didn't matter.
Even the forest around us had hanging moss, which has been in the movie, but I'd never seen in the area before. I was almost close enough to see through the windows. Remembering the children's handprints, I took a few more steps forward.
I think I wanted to look inside to prove that the handprints weren't there, that this was just some other abandoned house. Before I got close enough to make out the interior, something happened which shakes my core to this day.
The sound of a child softly crying started out of one of the upstairs windows. That was when my nerve broke. I turned and ran like I've never run before or since. I ran as the unfamiliar section of mossy forest fell into darkness around me. I don't know how long that road really was, but I ran till I could see the river, and then slowed, but didn't stop till I was back on a trail I knew, back in my forest. Exhausted, I sat and stared back down that road in the light of a nearly full moon. I took in every detail, memorized exactly where it was so I could come back the next day. I watched to see if anything had followed. By the time I got home, it was past 3 in the morning. I'd been gone over 12 hours. What had started as an afternoon walk had turned into the scariest event of my life. When I went back the next day with my dad at my side, the path was gone.
I've been living in these woods for over a decade since, and have never seen the trail, or anything like it ever again.
Nor have I ever gotten lost, or come across a section of forest that seemed too big.
However, in years since, the hanging moss I'd seen has spread through the area where the trail was, even though it never grew there in my youth. And every now and then something in the distance sounds like that crying, the same crying I'd heard that day.